And if it turned out that as you move on, you're like, oh, that prevents this path. Now the question is like, can we get away with that path not being there? Do we have to rebuild?
That's the saddest one.
Or do we just fix it in the sequel?
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 483 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's August 30, 22x4. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. And we would also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for letting us grab your money every month to help support the podcast. And of course, if you're looking to donate, just head on over there and go for it. We'd appreciate it. Today's episode, we got a lot of things cooking internally, but in a weird way, it's kind of more of the same.
Yep.
We're on the content grind. We're just cramming as much stuff into the game as we can, as fast as we can into Crashlands 2. And unfortunately, if we talk about it, it's just spoilers. It's just pure spoilers, top to bottom. So we're kind of in that weird state where we can't really talk too much about the game on the podcast. So we're just going to go right into questions.
Well, we can do a quick PSA first too, which is new COVID boosters are out. Go get boosted. Even
Get
if you
that
had
COVID boost.
get boosted anyway, because it does different things, works different ways, helps you out anyway. So go get, take care of yourself, take care of the people around you. Go get boosted.
Yeah,
Get your flu shots.
I did just have it for like 2 weeks. Not fun.
Yeah. You don't want
That thing.
And that's with you've been vaccinated many, many times.
Oh, yeah.
Still a nightmare.
Yeah.
The thing is, you can always be more vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I pull up the list of like, because when I go to my Walgreens app and I'm like, all right, time to sign up for a booster, and they're like, what other vaccines you want? I'm like, ooh,
What you got?
still
You
got
got
what I
some?
do. And I'm over here because my wife's an ex-physician, so I'm over here and I'm like, should I get the monkeypox vaccine? And she's like, you probably don't need that. I'm like, but I could get it though, right? Which is. I think I had this a million years ago. I had a brief aborted stint in the Peace Corps, and to do that, I had to get like 1 million vaccines, and it was one of my favorite parts of the whole experience.
You just feel so powerful.
It's just
after,
I felt fucking invincible because I had
I can't die.
Yeah, because I got even the rabies vaccine, which like nobody gets in the U.S. anyway, and you can't even get it if you want it because it's like reserved. There's not very much of it.
Cool.
But I was just like, it was just. I think I had like 10 different vaccines, and I was just like, I'm a god.
You got it. You see a wild animal running around. You're like, yeah.
If
it bites me.
I can lick it. I can eat it. It can bite me. Any interaction can happen, and it's just fine.
Yeah. All good.
Yeah. So
But
anyway,
vaccines they're like the real life version of like a raid buff in an MMO.
Yeah.
Where it's like you go to the local healer and they're like, and they cast this buff on you that lasts for like 10 years and you just can't get diseases. Like,
yeah. Or when you do, they're just, blunted significantly, which, is also
you can
extremely
get the
good.
disease, but you don't give a fuck. You just ride it out.
Yep.
Yeah, it's I wish there was a way you could just like go to the pharmacy and you'd be like, "Hey, I'm here for the vaccines."
Yep.
Just be like,
whatever
be like,
you got.
which ones you want? You're like, yeah, just go nuts.
Yep.
Just if they would be cool if they had something that was just like like a cluster of syringes.
Yeah, they
just jam it. Yeah, you'd be sore.
Yeah, I'd do
But
it.
man, you'd be invulnerable
Yeah.
for decades. So yeah, I'll be signing up for all that stuff. Hit me up.
Yeah, I think it's still better, at least my wife's advice to me, which is not medical advice for anybody else, is to wait until like October-ish for the flu vaccine, because the flu vaccine's efficacy is kind of short. It's kind of short-lived, so it's better to do it like as you're coming into the real flu season, which typically starts around then. But
what if you just get 2 of them?
or you just get 2. I mean, that's personally, that's the kind of thing that I would like to do.
There's a pharmacy in my grocery store. So just, every Sunday I get some groceries, go get my flu shot.
Yeah. Every
Sunday.
They're like, sir, we think you have a problem. And you come in with a different mustache.
Actually, do you remember that in the earlier?
I've got a lot of solutions. Is what I have.
I think like a year or two into the COVID vaccine, once we had that available, there was a study because there was some. I think it was like in Germany. There was some guy who'd gotten the COVID vaccine 200 times, and they were trying to figure out like, okay, this is an interesting case study because like. Yeah.
Because there's all these people who are like, oh, the vaccine will kill you.
Yeah.
And this guy just fucking went ham.
But now there's this
on it.
really interesting question, which is like, because so much about this stuff is really unknown because it's so hard to study and immune responses to stuff are like really complicated. And so it's all a big mess. And you see this in like different vaccines. We're like, oh, this vaccine lasts for 10 years. This one, I don't know, maybe 6 months. You know, like there's all these unknowns. And one of the big questions included in that is like, is it actually helpful to get over vaccinated? And the general consensus is like, no, probably. It's probably not harmful, but it's also probably not helpful. So there's no point. And I don't remember the result because it's also hard to even ask the question. Like once you have this case study of this guy with 200 fucking COVID vaccines, is like, how do you even ask? Like, did it work?
I think
what do you test for?
I think the problem is like, who the fuck gets 200 vaccines? Like the comorbidities happening in this dude. You know what I mean?
It's too many vaccines.
He had to do it like every other day, basically.
So like, what kind of person does that? It feels like a weird risk taking or who knows what.
Well, I think it's not, I think this thing is like, because vaccines basically, they just aren't risky, right? They just really aren't.
No, but like you're getting stabbed every day, which is like, it's not like it's fun to be sore and stabbed every day. You know what I mean? So like,
you get used to it.
He must have gotten used to it.
But
there's like probably something else going on there. But that question of like, because now you get to answer these questions, like, because we all know, like, with getting the boosters, like, yeah, it could fuck you up to varying degrees of like making you feel sick for a day or two, right?
Right. But does it do that the 13th time?
Does it do
20th time?
Does it get worse over time? Does it just always the same?
Or do you become immune to vaccines?
But also, even if you ask the guy this, like, because all you can do is self-reporting. So if he's gotten used to it, he'll be like, yeah, I don't even notice it.
I feel fine. Yeah.
But he might still actually experience the symptoms, and there's no way to know, which is, it's
Have you guys heard of the meme about Spiders George? No. Have you heard about this 200 vaccine guy makes me think of Spiders George. People are like, oh yeah, like the average person eats like 4 spiders in their sleep every year.
By the way, a fully made up thing.
Yeah. Or rather, not in their sleep, but just, eats this many spiders every year on accident or whatever.
Fully made up, not a real
It's like, actually, what if it's really just the case that nobody eats spiders except for one fucking guy who is just devouring millions of spiders every day.
Which is a good tale on why you shouldn't trust averages. Yeah, they're nonsense most of the time.
Yeah.
The median person does not eat any spiders
at all,
any time ever,
unless they're part of your regional menu. In which case, there's probably you're probably eating some spiders. But for places that don't eat spiders as part of like the normal course of things, which is I think most places, you're eating 0 spiders. That's the number. You were
eating the whole thing about like the average number of eyes is actually less than 2. You know, technically,
most people have above average numbers of every limb, every body part. All that stuff.
And that's despite the fact that some people have more than standard because it's way less common than people having less than standard, So averages are just not useful.
I do wonder nowadays, if you're a 6-fingered person, the kind of bullshit you have to put up with people accusing every photo that you're in of being you're like, excuse me, this is just I was here first. I've had 6 fingers for decades, and these fuckos come in trying to take all my.
Now everybody's got 6 fingers.
Steal my thunder. Yeah. Anyways, let's get into some questions. All right. Highest upvoted question from podcast.bscotch.net comes from Wuzzle, who says, "Hey, brothers, I was wondering if you had to deal with utter stupidity and or pure narcissistic behavior that threatened to ruin your whole business/project/life situations. If you're comfortable with talking about it, an example, and how you dealt with it would be greatly appreciated."
Sounds like Wuzzle's going through some stuff.
To ruin. I think the danger of answering a question like this is that the kind of situation that is being described here is with the kind of person who holds a grudge and watches for a long time and looks for any opportunity to make things worse again. I was just prefacing it with that.
I don't think we've had a scenario like that in any capacity with the studio. I mean, like that's part of the benefit of being so tiny. We don't actually have a lot of exposure to like. We
try to avoid exposure to the complete maniacs. We've had we've been exposed to a little bit of that when we've done hiring.
Yes.
Without going into any details for all the reasons I listed a moment ago, we at one point when we were trying to hire people, we did have one person who threw up some red flags during the interview process, and we were like, okay, no. And that person
got real weird.
That person asked for just basically asked if they could get some guidance on like why and whatever. And this is why, by the way, employers don't do this. They don't tell you why, because
they don't know what you're.
Because sometimes this happens, and I can't remember if it was me or Seth, but one of the two of us kind of put together like a constructive summary. It was very carefully articulated. Like, oh yeah, there are these things that we care about that we didn't see evidence of. It was basically like still pretty like soulless, from like because we were being careful about it. But the result was still the same, which is basically, which again, like we said no for a reason, which was the red flags and
more of them just popped right out.
Boy, yeah, they turned into a whole thing.
The thing about red flags is they multiply, like amoebas. Yeah. You see one of them, and if you start really looking at it, you realize it's fractal. It's made of a billion more red flags all the way down.
I have had an occasion more recently where I was talking to somebody in it was a business kind of context, but also kind of like it was like a mixed one because it was like with somebody in games that like might be useful in the context of what we're doing in the studio, but also kind of a more because like, we just talked to other indie studios to like shoot the shit and talk shop, right? And I got a vibe very quickly that like actually freaked me out like as I was talking to this person where I was like I kind of had this just like sinking like oh no sort of feeling where I was trust where I was like I need to extricate myself from this and just get away from it with like minimal contact and like try to because like I was like something is really off along those dimensions, along this like kind of narcissism, like the kind of person who just like can't let a thing go and somehow everything is about them, where I was like, I could just feel that that's what this was. And it legitimately emotionally like put me in a panic.
It'll freak out. Yeah. I think that we've mainly dealt with it or like the main exposure to it. And again, I think this is mainly a thing you see as essentially as you scale up or as like your efforts scale up and you just have a lot more exposure to people, right? Again, like the benefit of a really small team and especially like the core three of us being family members and then actually like half the studio effectively being also family members, we don't have a lot of exposure to essentially just other people. But if you hit in the
within
like
the studio,
if you hit in like that 30 to 50-ish size, like once you're in that and above, there's just a lot of people in that mixture. And then there's a lot of interfacing between those people and the outside world and all that stuff. And so there's a lot more exposure to it. I think the most common place I've seen it is actually just when we're at conferences and you'll get like really pushy people.
Yeah.
Again, they're talking about not necessarily about their own projects. They're trying to get you to do something. Right. And it doesn't make any sense for like, there's no value for you, but it would be of course valuable for them. But there's like I don't know. It's like it's really uncomfortable.
I feel like we haven't actually had something meaningfully threaten our position in this domain because somehow or another, all three of us have really aggressive bullshit detectors. Where like we trust our gut. We are pretty decent, I think, at reading people, and we don't always assume the best. Like if somebody's throwing off weird vibes, we rarely go like, maybe I'm wrong about that. Usually we're like, okay, I'm probably right about this, but and we'll give it more time. But there's,
I think I used to actually be much more on the benefit of a doubt thing. I think.
100%.
I think it's like blocking people on social media, right? Where it's like even a little bit of a level of success. Cause we're not famous by any stretch, right? But we have enough visibility that we're in that territory where there's just a lot of people who are interacting with us in that direction, right? And Sam, like you're saying, like in the earlier days, I was like, yeah, every one of these interactions, I should like get the benefit of the doubt.
Yes,
try to maintain whatever. And now, the moment there's even the slightest hint that I'm not even necessarily worried about, I'm just like, there are so many people that I have to interact with now, right? That it's not even worth like the effort of like,
can't be risky. Basically.
So instant mute, instant block, instant ignore, whatever. And that's it. And frankly, once you get to any level of scale, because you can think of it like even as your email inbox, it's like I get 10 unsolicited emails about various things that people want to ask of me a day, right? Which is actually pretty light for where we're at. And again, in the earlier days, I used to read all of them and be like, oh, is this like legit? Should I like respond to this person? Yeah, and now it's just like, usually the subject line is enough for me to block and mark as spam, right? Yeah. And sometimes I'm a little uncertain, so I open it up and the first sentence, block and spam, right? But it's not just delete. I'm like, no, I don't want, it's actually putting blockers up everywhere because there's too much of it. And it's fine. I think it's one of those like, people have a lot of sort of thoughts about like the meaning of this, like of preventing somebody from contacting you, that kind of stuff. It's like, it doesn't even have to be because you think they're bad or because like there's a real negative thing. It literally can just be like, I see so many opinions I don't want to see, about stuff that doesn't even matter. And so if someone's just like making my life a little worse by having bad opinions that I don't need to hear,
it's really like it's
block and move on.
It's just it's an intentional problem. I don't have time. You just don't have time for it. Right? So I think the transition for me has been, I would say in my early 20s, I was terrible at, to be honest, as far as like making the judgment call about someone earlier. I would tend to wait a very long time before I'd be like, okay, yeah, there's like a few bodies now. I guess maybe they're a murderer, like that. More so where.
But the first couple, it's like, yeah, but like maybe they just had a bad Monday.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. It always felt like that was the thing to do. But yeah, as we've gotten, I think it's just as like the reality of I don't know how to put it. As I've gotten older, it's felt increasingly like the people who really care about whether or not you succeed are very, very few. Like as far as like other people really taking the time to care about what your interests are or having your interests at heart, right? There's just very few. There might be people who are like setting it up or whatever else, but there's very few who, no one's going to care the way you care about whatever it is you're making.
It's all about skin in the game.
It's skin in the game. Exactly. Yeah.
It's your life. It's your stuff. They may be interested, like they may care in that way.
Yes.
But whatever happens to you, especially if it's a just tangential relationship, like whatever happens to you doesn't really mean anything to them.
Yeah. And I think we've had enough exposure to not just individual people, but also like some of these very large, gaming entities that some time ago that I had a very kind of rosy view of, and just with enough time being exposed to them, it was like, oh, actually they would like chew us up and use us in a heartbeat.
In a second.
And
that's kind of the direction I would take that into is, so first I'll say also we've gotten just really lucky because no matter what you're doing, if some asshole decides that they just want to create problems, then they're going to. And there's if
somebody has a lot of time and a grudge, they can do it.
Yes, it's the way I always think about, try not to create.
Yeah, it's the way I always think about. Like it's funny to like lock your door to your house and think that like that actually prevents somebody from getting into your house, because there's a million ways to get into a house. If somebody's determined to fuck your shit up, they completely can. And that applies to kind of everything, right? So,
so a lot of it, it's like
be positive, try to not draw that kind of thing onto you.
It's the same deal with like even legal stuff. Cause like a lot of the problems that people run into when they have a successful business, again, at any level, is they start getting sued by people for bullshit things. And people can really like make your life extremely miserable. And again, so far I think a lot of it is just we've stacked the dice and then managed to stay lucky on top of the stacked dice. Right. But the thing I wanted to kind of turn this into is we're talking about people here. Right. But it's turned out that the real problem has been companies because companies are narcissistic,
correct,
piece of shit assholes as entities because of who runs them at the top, right? The individual interactions with the people may or may not be that way. The ones that we have are not because we don't continue those. But that doesn't. But because you're like especially with a big company, you're interacting with people at a way lower level than the people at the top. And like the reason those companies are big is because they're run by assholes. That's just how that works. So, but the people that you interact with are not necessarily, right? And so this is where you get this conflict where the company as an entity wants all of your shit and basically wants to make all of your stuff theirs. That's the end goal of any company, right? That you interact with. But the people
any publicly traded company to be
yeah.
Private companies are often I mean, I like there was a
private companies have the option of not doing that, but that doesn't mean that they don't.
It depends on their situation. But like there was an interesting, lots of like interviews with the CEO of Larian, who made Baldur's Gate 3. Mm-hmm. So they're a private company. And people were asking about like DLCs, in-app purchases, like how are you going to like do more to like monetize the game? Oh, and he's like, we're not gonna. Like we sold enough copies and we have enough money. So good to go, right? And you, like every now and then you'll see like small business. I think it was like the Arizona iced tea people who make, right. So like there's an interview with their president, and he's like, yeah, like we're not increasing the price because like we're profitable. So like
we don't need to.
Yeah, we don't need more money because we have enough money to do what we want to do. So, but the problem is like if having more money is always the goal, then there's no such thing as enough.
Yeah.
Right. So
I think even you become
like a Katamari ball of just like
and when
absorbing everything.
When you only have short term operations, right? Because it's like, if the big companies that we interacted with that are the platform holders, that kind of stuff, right, were interested in their long-term viability, then they would basically use a progressive system, like the tax sense, right? Of like when it comes to store cuts, right? They would basically be like, well, if you haven't made any money yet, we don't take anything. And like, as you worked your way up, they would take more, right? Because that's what creates longevity in the pool of businesses making games for their platform, that kind of stuff. Because it's all about survival. But what we actually see in practice is exactly the opposite. Because
Steam does literally the opposite.
Yeah, Steam does literally the opposite. The other platforms got
system.
Yeah, at least Google and Apple, as of a couple of years ago, only because of fear of
after enough lawsuits
of lawsuits
and public problems.
Yeah. Finally made it so at least there's a 15% cut instead of 30 for your first million or something like that, which honestly is
huge.
I think is perfect. That's basically, I think I would love it to be smaller than that, obviously. Right. Mm-hmm. But at that point, I'm like, I feel like your claim that you're providing a service in exchange for some amount of revenue, I feel like at that level I can buy
on balance. It's good.
I can buy it. That's fine. But it's all this short-term thinking. And like when you read contracts by these big entities, when they're trying to get your stuff, right? Mm-hmm. They really, really try to take all of it, just all of it. So I think
I won't
been
disclose
lucky about people
specifics,
so far.
But I have an example. We were working with a company on some marketing stuff. They were going to help us with some marketing, right? And in the contract, it was like, well, in order for them to help us with marketing, we would need to provide them with marketing materials.
Yeah, trailers,
posters, box art, all that stuff, right? And in the contract, they had in there that whatever we send them, they own it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that means that if we wanted to use our trailer to market stuff ourselves, we would have to then license it from from
Yeah, because
by sending it to them, they would own it.
Yeah, because what they needed, because of how intellectual property law works, was they needed basically a license to be able to like reproduce and use it and modify it, that kind of stuff. So
which we could have given them if that was in the contract.
Because you'll see that also in contracts that is required for stuff to work for digital things, which is always freaky when you see it because the language makes it sound like they're taking everything, even when they're actually just basically saying like, hey, we need the right to actually show this to people on our platform. And so it requires a lot of careful reading. But again, like Seth is saying, like a company they'll just go all the way to the end of that.
Because he said it is like for a larger company, they know that they have more leverage, and they have lawyers, and the lawyers are charged with the task of watch out for my client. The lawyer's job is not make sure everybody gets a good deal.
Yeah, I think that's
right. Their job is to protect the client.
Yeah, so the piece that I want to mention here, which it's sort of regardless of whether or not it's a public traded entity, private entity, whatever else. The reality is
it's always
Well, what's weird about it is that you're dealing with a thing that doesn't actually exist. You cannot talk to a company, right?
Yeah, you talk to a whole bunch of different people with different incentives in different departments.
But also the reality is like your individual relationship you might have with a person will oftentimes, especially in business, they'll be very good, right? Yeah, of course, because if they're a good business person, like they're going to be enjoyable to talk to. They'll listen.
We met so many great people at every company, that we've interacted with.
Yeah, and so the
great people.
The tricky part is basically not entangling who you're talking to with the company in the sense that like
when they tell you, oh, we'd never enforce that, that's when oh shit.
Yeah. Okay. And it's like, look like Jerry, I trust you, but literally you are not the person who's going to be deciding this. Like, this is a fact going into the company, and the company is sort of this. So it's like you're talking to a person who's like almost like a spiritual guide for some like much larger entity that actually is kind of doing its own thing, right? And so the tricky part is not entangling those in a way that makes it so you do really dumb shit that makes you overly generous to a company that, again, it's not even, I don't even mean it in a bad way, but it's like the whole idea of the narcissism aspect or whatever else, like so much as the reality is that the company, whoever you're talking to, even ours included, right, has to make sure that it doesn't fucking die. Like, that's sort of the whole point, right? Or in some cases, always show growth, whatever. Everyone's got their things, right? But you need to keep that in mind whenever you're having a person-to-person interaction, right? Is that you are not talking to the company. If the company was
what that person wants and what they're trying to do, they're trying to strike a good deal. They're trying to do blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, it's not just up to them. And other people will get involved. And what that person wants may not align with the overall incentives and goals of the company at large, right? Mm-hmm. And it's tangly.
Yeah, well, the game that I always like to play is when I'm looking at a contract, I always ask if this person had some kind of a mental breakdown, if it's a contract with a person, right? Then would I still trust this contract? And if the answer is no, because I basically think of like, I'm not signing this contract with this person now. I'm contracting with whoever this person ends up being under any set of circumstances in the future, right? And with a business, it's the same deal, but the way I think of it is the easy one for a business is to think, if somebody bought this company that I now have a contract with, meaning they could just now change everything. So, right. So like now nothing is certain because a company can just be bought by some other company, no matter who's running it right now, even if you trust it all the way to the top. What if it gets bought next year? What if it becomes part of a private equity firm's holdings, right?
It's basically asked the question, what would happen if a like essentially a sociopath was executing this contract?
Yeah, and because someday they probably will be.
Yeah, the person you're talking with gets laid off. Suddenly, there's a new person there.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying it's not even like the person, right? It's sort of like it's the entity, because the entity is
purely self-interested.
Yeah. So you know, if we do a deal with any one of these big corporate entities, like we do, like we have our Netflix one, we have our Xbox, we've had our Xbox one in the past. Like we're always keeping in mind that at the end of the day, it is a business thing as much as like. You're trying to make it so that everybody actually is having a good time, right? Everyone's like, yeah, we all agree this is a good deal, right? And you can definitely get there, and that's a thing.
And we do.
But you have to.
I mean, we don't sign deals if we feel like there's something weird going on.
But we still know there's risks involved.
But all of the deals we've done have taken months of negotiation back and forth, right, to get everything clarified. And I think that's a really important note, which is like,
don't just take everything as it gets sent to you.
Yeah, a lot of the indies are just like, oh wow, and they sign, and that's just don't do that, because it's like,
and again, it's one self-interested party with all the leverage negotiating with another self-interested party, which is us, right, with basically no leverage, right, and the initial terms of that will always be against us as the smaller entity with no leverage, and that's why we negotiate, right? And it's kind of weird too, because like Sam was saying, if a company doesn't look out for its own interests, it will stop existing.
Yeah, it has to. It's not even like a mean thing to say, but
it doesn't.
Some of them are a lot more aggressive.
Way.
Some of them are a lot worse about it, the way that they go about it. And again, it all depends on what country are they in? Like, what are the laws of that country? Are they publicly traded or privately, or even if they're private, who are their investors? Have they recently been taken over by a private equity firm who's just looking to slash costs and exploit everything, right? Mm-hmm. Like, there's so many angles there that just don't take anything at face value. Read the fine print and negotiate stuff. Like if something looks fishy, it is, and bring it up and try to get that thing changed or removed.
Well, I guess and to Adam's point from earlier about being lucky, but also stacking the dice in our favor with regards to not even just our business interactions, but our people interactions. If you're getting bad vibes, right, from a person, just be done. You're done. Don't worry about it.
You don't know anybody, anything.
Yeah, person, business interaction, like any of those things, just
be polite, but just be like, oh, it's not for me.
Yeah, because and they're like, that becomes a new puzzle, which is the goal of like, how do I extricate myself without increasing my risk, right? And that becomes the new game you're playing, rather than like, how do I negotiate an interesting best outcome for all parties? It's now like, okay, how the fuck do I get out of here, but without making it likely that this person now creates a problem. And again, like a lot of it is like it's doing your best to present yourself in a way that makes people not want to do that. That's the kind of the stacking of the dice part, right? But that doesn't get you all the way there because there's people out there that are just going to create problems. And so the rest comes down to luck and then how you manage it once it starts to happen. And we've been very fortunate so far.
Be diligent, and just, I wouldn't say trust no one, but trust yourself. You know what I mean? Trust your gut.
I would say look out for yourself.
Yeah.
Because you, at the end of the day, like
no one else will.
You are, you are, and not in like a mean way, but yeah, to a degree. Like you're the person where the buck stops.
You have the most skin in the game for your own situation.
So don't just give it up super easily because someone vaguely suggested something would be better for you.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't. Sometimes your choices are limited, and so you just have to do the best you can. Then hope you can navigate it on the other side. And sometimes that gets really bad. And unfortunately, by the time you're in that position, like each one of those is kind of different and its own whole thing. And
but extrication is still the goal.
Yeah, extrication is the goal. Yeah.
Get out of there however you can. All right, next question comes from Gibbs, who says, do you guys have a favorite method of planning and developing software solutions to problems? Favorite software design patterns or ways of thinking about things?
This kind of suggests you'd be able to like give it a name or or like.
I mean, I think the way that we tend to do things, I don't know if you'd call it like a design pattern or whatever, is we go for usable MVPs with rapid iteration in pretty much all scenarios. So every new mechanic we want to do in a game, we're like, okay, let's what's the fastest way we can try that out and see, and then use our imaginations to fill in the blanks of what's missing, right? We're just like, would this be good? And get it to that point first, and then we iterate. So
I think it depends on the kind of thing though too, because I think the goal for games as software is so different from the goal as like a more utilitarian software, right? In terms of like, so think of it like, because the game, there's a lot more of like, there's a way higher degree of uncertainty about if a feature is good.
Yeah,
right.
Most things are far more ambiguous for a longer period of time if they're set
and it all has to be integrated in a more in a closer way, I guess, right? To like, because you want everything impacts everything in a much more integrated way. So that I think when it comes to making games, we have to have, at least for our style of doing it, this much more iterative, experiential, and kind of prototyping kind of based approach.
You got to body
because you got to see it. Yeah, you got to see what happens when you do.
I think about like it's like if you ever go to an open house or something like that from a house that you've seen on Zillow or whatever else, like you got to body the house. You can't just look at the house's pictures and then be like, yeah, that'd be good. That's not the full experience. It's nothing of it. And that's kind of like what you start with on the design side, right? You gotta be able to walk into the space in the same way as if we're developing one of these things. But to Adam's point, if you're doing something that is more, but almost like more purely technical, less experiential, then I think the design pattern doesn't necessarily have to be.
Because you still have a bit of that, but I think you have more. I think you have kind of more options at your disposal. Because I think this is also different because like I'm the one who builds that stuff, and Seth's the one who builds the game stuff from a software standpoint, And so we also have different kinds of brains, different ways that things work for us. So there's also that bit that kind of complicates things. But for me, because I'm over here building non-game software most of the time, or all the time really, and for that, like I feel like I get to do more of like planning ahead for some things that are likely. Right. Even if I don't need to deal with those now, I'm like, okay, it's very likely that I'm going to have to deal with the scale problem, deal with this authentication problem, deal with the security problem, deal with this, whatever, like deal with this like set of things so that I can make room for that stuff earlier in the process of actually developing and creating the software.
You're trying to have enough knowledge about what's coming that you don't paint yourself into a corner, basically.
Yeah. So I can I can like keep making my future life a little easier by doing a lot of upfront sort of planning and philosophizing and that kind of stuff. And it does require still like, now I got to go try it, experience it.
Yeah, so everything you're describing as like stuff that you do differently than me, I'm like, yeah, I do all that.
No, I'm not saying it's different. I'm saying the emphasis of where like the of the shape of the problem, because I think it's the same shape. I agree with that completely.
To me, it's exactly the same.
Maybe it is exactly the same.
Even like when you're talking about like experiential versus utilitarian. Like at the end of the day, it's all meant to be experience. And if the experience is bad, the utility doesn't matter. And so
I think there's a fundamental difference though between being able to answer a question, does this work, with an actual yes or no versus a
I don't think so.
I think so. I mean, think about it.
I mean, it works in the same sense that like in Crashlands 2, we have our building system, right? And I go through like an algorithm to say like, okay, does the algorithm compute buildings, right? Does it work? Yes or no? But if at the end of the day it doesn't make sense to the player, if it's unintuitive, blah, 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 then it actually doesn't work. Even though like technically behind the scenes, what we said it was supposed to do, it does do that thing. There's still an end goal. So similarly, when it comes to,
I guess I'm saying though, to be clear, that's like, there's a difference between, let's say you have like a file conversion software, just as like the simplest case. Does it convert the file right accurately? Is like a very clear. It's
what I'm saying is that question doesn't matter, because how do you interact with the software dictates whether the file conversion it will even be experienced. So, for example, if a file conversion software requires me to go to GitHub, download a bunch of bullshit, and then install a bunch of packages and then memorize command line stuff, to me, that doesn't work. Even though technically the code behind the scenes can convert the files. Because
I guess you're getting
there's a holistic view of like if something is not usable, even though once you've read a giant document, you technically can use it, it might as well not even exist.
But it's kind of I agree with you, but I think it's a downstream customer question, right? Because that's the reality of the answer. The answer is very related to who is judging your work as whether or not it meets criteria, right? Because if you're saying I'm designing a software solution, let's say I work inside of a larger enterprise, so I am doing something that is essentially it's in there in a way that like I don't have it doesn't surface in a way to like the full end of the product design stuff. The user doesn't touch it, but it's doing something. Then the thing you got to be able to answer confidently is like, does this do the job for the person like downstream from me? So if I'm handing this off, if I'm developing some API endpoints or something, right, for some internal thing, and I'm handing these off to someone to use, are they able to use them? Like you said, to kind of like, is the experience of using them good? Is the experience of I
think it's always there's always and it's often described as like a front end versus back end, of like what's it doing behind the scenes versus how do you actually interact with the thing.
Yeah, and probably the way to think was like it's like the experienced outcome versus the thing that makes that happen is right, which doesn't have good language for, but I think you're right that like the front end back end sort of way of framing things isn't actually.
There's no real distinction to me. Yeah, because like
it should be experienced versus like architected or
because you can't have a front end with no back end, because then that's just a picture of things.
Well, you're saying that the back end informs the shape of the front end, which makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
and also what people and it goes both ways. It's like you're gonna come up with like what needs to happen, but then once you've coded that up, then you have to ask the question of like, okay, but like who is this for now, and how are they gonna understand this thing? So then you have to think about
to reshape it,
Yeah, and then of course once people start using it, then they run into all kinds of shit where you're like, oh, I thought they were going to use it like this, but it turns out that there's other stuff that they need to be able to do, and then you go back and you change the back end, which then you change the front end.
I think I think maybe what I was
it's all the same. Right?
I think maybe kind of what I was thinking about is less about all of this, and it's more about the difference between the what of what we're because I think it's that like on the game side, so I think it's about the design part, right? Because when I'm thinking about like software design, when I'm making say like a web app, right? It feels like most of my thinking about it, because it is driven by like what the actual experience is supposed to be, right? But it feels like most of my design kind of parts of it are like underneath that layer most of the time. And it feels like for game design, like the parts that's taking all like the enormous amount of energy and effort and complexity, feels like it's a lot more time on that top bit.
Right.
And still not less time underneath, just like a lot more time on the top. Right. And that's like, I think maybe like the thing that's like, because I think you're right that they actually are the same. I think the thing that makes it feel different from me, like not doing game stuff, is watching game stuff. Is it feels like when I'm thinking about design stuff, like it feels like I very quickly go from like, okay, I need this experiential outcome. Like it feels like those are more straightforward most of the time. Mm-hmm. And then
they seem like
I'm
that,
down to the guts, but it actually might not be.
Have we talked about Blork?
No, we haven't.
I don't know if we have by name. Or maybe.
Okay, I won't say any more about it, but I'll just say that like we're working on some internal tooling in the studio, and Adam is building the whole ass thing and has been for months.
Or months now. Yeah.
And we got to a point where we started using it within like the first maybe 3 weeks of it existing.
Yeah, it was about 3 or 4 weeks in.
For doing some work planning and stuff.
It's basically a work management tool to replace Favreau or Trello or whatever the fuck you use. Right?
Yeah.
I got tired of all of them.
Internally, as in like we're not looking to replace those companies. We're just looking to have our own tool. And what's been interesting about that is like how we don't have that many people using it, but everybody has completely different preferences about what is a good experience, right? Yeah. And we have all these debates about, somebody's like, oh yeah, like when I click on this thing, this should happen. And somebody else is like, no, I want the opposite to happen. Right. Yeah. And these things come up
when I
all
see
the time.
this icon, it means this to me, but does this other person mean actually, because Seth and I just had a big argument, or not an argument, a big
design discussion.
Yeah.
About
trying to figure
words, just about like 4 words. Because what words you choose conveys so much clarity about what's about to happen when you click on a button that says something, right? And so that's where I'm saying like it, even though sort of like, and I get this as a programmer, same as you, Adam, where like the stuff that's like really kind of fun and interesting is like figuring out the logic of solving the programming problems. Mm-hmm. But actually the amount of time spent is about even in terms of like how do we figure out what the fuck the user actually wants from this and what they're trying to do with it and how to make it a good experience for different people of different opinions, right?
I almost think about like there's an art, because it feels like you're talking about architecture in a way. Like there is some split here, right? Where like the architecture of a piece of software is, and Adam, is kind of what it sounded like you were mentioning, which is that when you're talking about, I want to be able to enable this particular, user experience at the end, that means I need a thing shaped like this, that like how it interacts with all the databases, how all these different technical pieces stack together to be able to enable that. But then what you've enabled, you set up all the architecture such that you can do that. And then you actually just have a whole nother question, which is, okay, now that I can do that.
How do people use it?
Yeah. How do I make that really good? But I think that's kind of what we're talking about, right? It's like there's two, you can, in some ways,
if we think of it as like the design layer and the architecture layer, because like if we think of the design layer as like, this is what people experience, and this comprises like how, like the sort of the philosophy of the thing that we're making, right? And how we think it interacts with the person.
Yeah. And you can't answer, you can only answer so many questions about each of those. Yeah. Before you have to implement it and use it in order to discover the next set of questions, and both have to exist and both inform.
So maybe then the summary of what we do actually for all of our software, games and non-game software alike, is we could call it design and prototype driven. I think it's just rapid prototyping and rapid iteration. But when we say that, we don't mention design. I think that's the thing that's missing.
I don't believe in design. I believe in iteration.
No, you absolutely believe, because
like, to me, design is just about a general intent.
Yeah, I agree.
Because but
think of all the time we spend talking about the intent, and like, I agree with you in the sense of like, when I'm thinking of designing, I don't mean like so like in the web dev world, like Figma is like the big tool that everybody uses, where a designer, quote unquote, will come in and be like, I've drawn out how everything
is going to work.
Exactly.
I don't believe in that concept.
Yeah, I think that can have utility as part of that layer of trying to like do the design. But when I'm thinking of design, that's not really what I'm thinking of. I don't think design is about the details necessarily. I think it can cover a wide range of detail, I guess.
Maybe a better word for it, because it sounds like experience and architecture are the two pieces you're talking about, right? Because architecture,
because you also have to design all the underlying stuff too, right? So
but I think that
it's design everywhere.
I do want to say the piece that seems like it's missing though is that the tricky part is finding the seam, right? So what you guys are talking about is like, okay, you can only build so much. You have your intended experience figured out, right? To whatever level of detail is possible at that time, given where the project's currently at. But how do you know? And
you can only predict out so far what the possibilities are that you need to make room for.
And same thing with the architecture, right? It's like you can plan the architecture up to some point to meet both the current experience as well as whatever the next one is that you can see. But how do you find the seam where you basically carve off a little piece of combined experience and architectural changes, and then make that, and then start, like Seth was saying, iterating on that, right? I think that's that's the thing that's always missing from, like, of course, yeah, it's so easy to say, like, yeah, rapid prototyping is an iteration is like the way to do it. But how the fuck do you pick which pieces, right? Let's say you have like a website.
I like the framing of it like a biased random walk. You know, where it's like, that's the idea like of what bacteria does, where they just kind of like, they know the general direction that they're going roughly, and they move a lot around in the space trying to make their way there. And then as they move, they learn more about whether their movements are successful in getting them there, right?
Well, it's that classic, measure, plan, execute loop, right?
Oh, yeah, what is it?
Yeah. But I think what's missing in the loop is feedback, right? So like the reason that you start with a general intent. Here's the rough experience that we want to have. So like in the case of our work management tool, it's like we want to be able to actually have things be sequentially tied together in a way that we can plan, right? And we couldn't find anything that does that. So that's the core thing that we want to work towards.
And we can actually summarize it. The core operating principle, the design principle of the software is that things should show up to the right person at the right time. That's the core operating principle. And which means
if you're going to do something later, you should be able to just have that just show up later.
Things should show up at the right time to the right person.
I'm going to do this thing after I do this thing. Then you should be able to just make it be like that.
Which is funny because like
memorize everything.
Not to get it all the way into it, but like in principle, that's supposed to be what the goal of any work management software is.
Yeah, I would focus on it.
Yeah, I would challenge you to like go into whatever work software you use and just figure out like how well does this surface the right thing to the right person at the right time, and where are all the holes in all three of those parts of the puzzle, and how much work do you have to do to make that happen rather than it doing it for you.
I mean, there's a reason Slack is so popular in the corporate world, and it's because everybody has to constantly ask each other what the fuck is going on. So we have this design principle, right? And then our next move is like, okay, we don't know all the problems that we're going to run into until like as we're trying to see whether this thing will work and how to even do it until we've got something to interact with and start to answer those questions.
That's what I mean. So you're finding a seam, right? Where you're saying, okay, we have this experiential target. How do we carve a piece of it off that is representative of the end experience in a way that will actually inform us of something, right? Because you can carve the wrong piece off. And this is what happens a lot. Yeah. Or you can take something that's like where you're carving a piece of it off that like doesn't fucking make it. It doesn't actually deliver an experience.
So the seam is basically just all about questions, which is like, what question are you trying to answer with this next step? And try to figure out then what would be required for you to be able to answer that. So in the case of like Crashlands 2, at the very beginning, we had a lot of questions about how combat was going to work with the telegraph system. Basically. Like pretty much everything, right?
Which is hard. That's a hard place to be.
Yeah. And so we got the telegraph system in and kind of like how you aim and how you attack. But then we were like, okay, well, that's working. And it's possible for us to make all these complex, cool, interesting telegraphs, which is kind of the first question. Like, can we even do that? But then the next question is what will it feel like to actually play the game like visually with animations and stuff mixed into this? And because we were like, will that change things? And it turned out it did, right?
Which really comes down to knowing. So the key of like finding that boundary, right, is knowing the kinds of things that can cause your plan, right? Like, because you're basically developing and that's what I'm going to call that the design, right? You're like designing an experience to some level of detail, right?
Yes.
And the question is, what level of detail? And like, when do I stop doing that and go like attempt to implement the design thus far to collect more information about what is wrong with the design or what the next level of details need to be or whatever, right? And I think that boundary is basically where you start getting to the point where you successfully recognize that this is now a thing that can only be addressed experientially, right? And there's not just a way to do that. That's one of those things that you learn by
you just learn by doing
you learn by practicing the craft over time, because like, and this is why, like,
I mean, I made like hundreds and hundreds of game prototypes at this point. Yeah, exactly. So I have a pretty good sense of if I'm about to do something, I've probably done something kind of like it before. And I know kind of where it can go wrong, or
you also know like the high level sort of ways that designs of different elements interact. So like the whole idea that you'd be like, well, okay, we have this idea of how combat works, but knowing that the animations when they get added will change how it feels. Like that's one of those things that like when you're new to and this is true for any kind of design space or any kind of or problem space. So like in games though, like this is the kind of thing, it's like you learn over time the kinds of things that impact other things, the kinds of things that you, so that you understand where the uncertainties actually are. And like, and I think that's one of those things you just develop experientially yourself by building stuff. And frankly, you do it by planning too much or not enough. Like you're on the wrong side of the boundary, and you just always are, because there isn't an answer to that. Nobody's can nail that perfectly, right? So you're always on one side or the other, but over time you like learn better and better where to stop trusting your expectations and plans.
Yeah. I think your margin of error shrinks, but you're always wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, like the idea of like the method of planning is the idea of like trust your gut and your taste, but don't trust your ability to see into the future, of like plan and design to me is just all about like, what are we doing next? And we're doing that because we're working towards something, and we think that this is part of the path to get there. But as soon as you start going, what are we going to do after that? And then based on that, what are we going to do after that? And then you're just writing fan fiction at that point.
But I think it is an important. I think it's why oftentimes you hear the term design pillars. I feel like it's probably like one of the best examples of this is when you're working on, in the case of Crashlands 2, it's a 4-year project. You don't want to just start. You're not randomly building shit.
That's a college degree, right?
Yeah, we don't want to be spending the time randomly building in a direction where we don't know where it's going to end up. That's not the point. The point is where you are saying we're building a sequel to Crashlands 2. We want to have it feel like X, Y, and Z. Here's kind of like how it seems like, given those pillars. Like those really, again, the pillars are those fun ones you can always point back to. There are the highest generalized ideas of what the experience is like, right? That if you're working on like anything specific, a map, how the player moves, whatever, that you should be able to point to one of those and be like, this is in line, right, with these pillars. But the tricky part is like, to Adam's point about asking questions about auth, security, logging, whatever. It's like, there's all these things that you have to keep in mind while you're building all that, right? So you do have
and if you don't know what those are, you're going to get in trouble.
Yeah. And I think to Seth's point though, if you get too specific too early about things that are too far away, then and aren't focused so much more on the design pillar side, but more on like the really gritty implementation details. But so far before you've gotten there, or before they're needed to really answer a question about a thing that you are working on currently, that's where you start running into problems. And we did this a bunch actually in the beginning of Crashlands 2, right? Where
we had a lot of very specific designs that pushed out.
Didn't
work because they were too deep.
They're too detailed. But I do want to point out that like a lot of the effort in those designs, well, parts of them where it's like, oh yeah, the crafting system doesn't work the way that we had drawn up on paper, right?
Neither does build mode.
Or
combat or most things. But the essence of it was there.
That's what I mean. And like, it's what you're doing is I would think about it more like, if you're doing that kind of thing, you have to recognize you're exploring the possible specific places that you could go. But until you pick you can do that, and you probably should, frankly, to know kind of, again, to Adam's point about the broader architectural problems, how things are going to fit together at the end of the day. You need to do that to a degree, but it's really, and I think it's kind of impossible, frankly, to somehow perfectly line up on either knowing enough, right, about where you're going that you can actually like really realistically build there, or
you can't
keeping it general enough that you don't waste time,
Yeah, but you can try to maybe think about it from the question of like, if I solve one problem, will it even matter if I don't solve a different one first, right? So like there's the idea of like premature optimization, right? Of like, all right, let's say you spend most of your time in the first year of working on a 4-year game trying to optimize the game systems for RAM usage, right? But if it turns out that the game ended up being small enough that you didn't even fucking need to do that, or maybe it's a PC game and nobody cares about RAM at that point, or whatever the case may be, then you spent all that time doing something that didn't matter. And also, like, if you don't actually just like make a good game and get it finished, how well optimized it is means nothing to anybody, right? So you want to think about like, this next problem that I'm going to solve, will it even matter if I solve this problem, or are there other problems that need to be resolved first?
But also,
again, how do you answer them, right?
Yeah, but then being aware that like your example, RAM is a thing that has to be worried about. That does mean that like, well, you don't want to go solve RAM right now, right? What you do want to do is, as you're thinking through design options and like think through what the next move is.
Yeah, don't be dumb about it.
Exactly. Yeah. You still like look and think and be like, oh, but if we do this, and this where I think this is this idea of like projecting out what its purpose is, right? Is what you really need to settle on is what is the immediate next thing. But you can't only inform the immediate next thing by what's there right now.
Yeah,
it's still
how do I solve that
by,
in a way that doesn't paint me into a corner.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you still have to project out the possible options, but like we're saying, you can't do it at a really fine grained level of detail because then there's infinite possibilities and all you do is you spend all your time in that space and almost none of it is going to be what happens. So as you project out, stuff has to get fuzzier, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's where you rely on those pillars, right? To get that.
Yeah, and you rely on those pillars and just your experience and knowledge of what it means. So it's like at this point, we've now shipped a bunch of games, right? And so what we're thinking about as we're like exploring that space is like, it's most like the main focus is basically the player experience of interacting with the game. That's the main focus all the time. But then also for every one of those moves, the question is like, okay, how does the scale for the size of the content of what the game is going to be? Are we going to start running into trouble if we take this path, even though we think it's the best solution, right? And what is the impact on the timeline? What is the impact on this? Like we just make like rough predictions of how this next thing is going to impact the rest of development, what the final thing is. Like, you make like a rough idea of that before you go do it so that you have a sense of like, before you did it in the first place, like, is this definitely a bad move, even though like it feels like the next right thing, right?
Yeah.
And so that as you go and do that thing, you basically make room for the stuff that seems likely, right? If that stuff impacts this in some way.
Yeah. So I think that the interesting thing is I think the experience making Blork so far, that's that internal work tool has been really interesting.
We'll have more to say about it later.
Yeah, we'll have more to say about it. And I think this is to me the difference between like basically like a game, which again, you're trying to deliver a particular kind of more ambiguous feeling experience, right? A mood or an emotion versus a tool, which it's a lot easier. And I think we found this actually with Blork to upfront establish pretty clearly what the thing is supposed to do for you, right? There's a bit, it's easier to see that future.
Be fun is fairly ambiguous as like a.
Yeah. And so, but I think in the same way that like, if you started making a work tool and you're like, it should make work better. It's like, well, fucking duh. In the same way that a game should be fun. It's like,
I don't know. To me, at the end of the day, everything is about the emotional aspect of it. Like it should be fun and easy to sit down and figure out what you're going to do today. Fun and easy. Those are feelings.
They are, but the problem is that they don't actually, in the case of a tool, speak to like architectural stuff or build order, right? Like, again,
Well, yeah. That's where you say like, okay, then how do we make it fun and easy, right? And then you have a theory, right? But then everything that you're doing from that point forward is you're still trying to figure out how to make the tool get closer and closer to delivering that emotional experience. You don't want to be frustrated using your work tool. That's a feeling, right? You want things. You don't want to have to be confused. That's also something that you're going to feel.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is like the working on Blork has been interesting because I think it's the first time we were able to articulate clearly enough what we were trying to do from the jump, right? In a way that it didn't actually have an emotional contour to it. So in the case of Blork, we want to be able to model work the way that work actually gets done, essentially. So modeling dependencies, modeling
But we came at it because of how it felt to use other tools.
I agree, but I'm saying the solve, like the thing you're building is, I think far easier to articulate specifically.
Underneath the emotional layer.
Yeah, underneath the emotional layer. Yeah. I think in games...
Because I already articulated for Blork. Because like Blork underneath the emotional layer is get the right thing to the right person at the right time. It's that's the entire design goal, right? Is like that. And the reason for that is all of the like emotional and production related reasons, right?
Yeah, but to me, that's backwards. To me, that's not the goal. That's the mechanism.
But that's what I'm saying is that the mechanism is actually the most important piece. And I think that's the thing that's hardest to tease out the specifics about in games, right? Because again, if you say like, I want to make a game that's fun or a game that's blah, it's like, how does the player move, right? How does X happen? Like basically you're not being specific enough about what it is you're trying to build to be able to use those to use that emotional appeal.
Yeah. But if you say I want it to be satisfying when I attack an enemy, right? that's a much more specific thing, much in the same way that like when I open my work management tool, I just want to have an easy time just knowing what's about to happen.
Yep.
Right. So like that's
a good pillar. Like just clarity is involved.
Yeah,
there, right?
exactly. To me, it always comes down to you're trying to deliver an experience that feels a certain way. And the mechanism, the feeling is the goal, and the mechanism is just the means by which you get there.
Yes,
you know?
yeah. And I think what I'm trying to say though is that I think in the case of that work tool is that it was very easy to define that mechanism more specifically early on, versus, and again, there's like mechanics in video games, right? Like
it wasn't though. Because we debated about it for 4 hours to try to figure out.
I will completely disagree. It took 4 hours of debate, and then it took 3 weeks to get a thing that everybody enjoyed using, which is insane. If I built like a new game, right, in 3 weeks.
But we didn't enjoy using it. We spent several more weeks using it.
I'm saying like the total time scale is fucking nothing compared to.
Well, but I think that I think what the real thing is here, what we're actually talking about is complexity and scale. I think actually you're both right here in the sense that they are exactly the same problem actually, right? But the difference of like when you summarize the end goal, that's abstracted away from the complexity, right? So when we say like, oh, the game is supposed to be fun, you can make a game in a day that's fun, right?
Yes.
Right. So it's detached from complexity, right? So when we're trying to compare, like, what does it mean to build the games that we build, which are these big multi-year projects, right? Versus what does it mean to build our internal tools, which are usually like weeks to months long projects, right? Then, and also like, because if you think about it, so like when we're delivering fun in Crashlands 2, what we're actually doing is we're creating this enormous mountain of imaginary problems, right? That we then have to solve along all these dimensions and like make all this stuff happen. We end up with this huge piece of software that's doing fuckloads of individual kinds of things that also all interact with each other in these really complicated ways. So what we're building here is an enormous piece of software that has one final output, which is you have a good time interacting with it, right? But a million
components,
a million components and outputs right below that level, right? And like the work tool stuff is exactly the same shape. It's just scaled way down, right? It's like way down. And the things that make up what we're delivering so far towards the experience of like, it should be satisfying and not frustrating and not confusing to get your work done, right? The sort of mechanisms that we're using to deliver that right now are just like a tiny number of like kinds of things compared to what's going on. So I think really the difference here probably that we're all actually reacting to is just a scale difference.
Yeah, probably right.
It feels, but at the end of the day, it's all made of smaller moment to moment experiences. Like, so I can, like in Blork, if I click a checkbox to mark something as done, how should that feel? What should happen? How clear should it be? What should the feedback be, et cetera?
Well, even above that, should you even be clicking a checkbox? How should it feel to finish a piece of work? Like the higher
what does a checkbox even mean?
Yeah. You know? Yeah. And so, like when we're making a game, it's the same. Like we'll have stuff in the game that is a checkbox. Or whatever, and we have to answer similar questions.
What I'm trying to articulate is that the thing that was fascinating with the Blork thing versus Crashlands 2 was that the build order for Blork felt very clear from the get-go. And again, to Adam's point, it may just be it's probably the scale factor of it.
Yeah, I think it's the relative complexity of the not the problem, but the solution, right? Because as Seth I think correctly said, like the problem for Crashlands 2 is make a fun game that feels like original Crashlands. Like that's the problem, right? So like on the surface, simple problem, right? Mm-hmm. And we could have chosen lots of ways that the solution could have happened at varying degrees of complexity and scale, right? But the complexity of the solutions to the problems that we were trying to address are just extremely different between these two pieces.
Yeah, because I think and to talk about this like carving point and like essentially what the design method is there, the decision about build order to me is one of the most crucial ones.
And by that you mean which thing do we make? Which feature do we make when, basically?
Yes, and to Seth's point earlier, trying to ask the question of what thing, if I nail down some more specifics about it, will actually experientially deliver me closer to where I'm going and inform the most to all the other things that I haven't built yet. And I think, Adam, to your point about scale, it's like if you have a system with as many parts as like Crashlands 2 does, that all have to come together to deliver that final experience is very different in scale.
And anything you do because of what the experience is of playing Crashlands, which is a lot more it's just a lot more holistic, and the degree to which one thing impacts another thing, right? It's a lot more sort of threaded together, so that when you're dealing with build order questions and all this kind of stuff, right? It makes it a lot harder to figure out.
To me, build order questions, though, like they're the hardest to figure out which ones to ask at the very beginning.
Oh yeah.
Like as soon as you can interact with,
when you don't have any
thing,
answers to any questions, then
as soon as you interact with the thing, you have to become the speaker of the machines. Like you just have to be able to interact with it and like listen to yourself of how it feels and listen to other people. And like other forces will just like manifest answers to the next question once it's out in the world.
Yeah. I think the thing that's so fraught though about the early process, right, is that the shape that you have decided upon in any of those early things, any of them, whether it's how we're moving, scale of the world, whatever else, have such enormous reverberative consequences for the entire shape of everything.
Yeah.
The entire shape.
Because of the scale. Because the eventual scale, because these are foundational. And because I think if we think of like the work tool, it's the same core problem. It's just that the scales, because I think you're right. Yeah. In Blork, the core problem is basically like, how do we model the data, right? Because that has all of these knock-on effects for like,
yes.
How does it get stored in the database? How do I make sure it's persistent? How do I make sure everybody has the same data? How do I make sure that the structure of the to-do list, because it's basically a fancy to-do list, right? So how do we like make so that the nature of the to-do list doesn't allow for things that are technically invalid and not supposed to happen, right?
Or too slow.
Yeah, or too slow or too whatever, right? And there were some decisions that I had made before the version that we're using right now where I'm like, fuck, right? Now it's like it's too late. It's too late to take those back, and those are now limiters on the maximum scale this thing can have. Whether or not
you would never have been able to answer that question.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying that that early period is the most fraught because you're basically you're
going to pay yourself into some corners. The question is it going to be fine? Yeah.
And so I think
you just got to move.
It's scale stuff. It's like player movement. You hear the stuff about how people with like N64 Mario and stuff, how they spent just months figuring out how Mario moves. And it's like, mechanically that is the core experience the player's having. So, and you can't
make levels. Yeah. You can't make levels.
You can't make anything.
Yeah. Well, and importantly, once you've built a bunch of levels, you can't change the movement because the levels are built off of change all of it.
And that's what I mean, where I'm like, there is a build order. There's a natural build order in these things. I think being able to sort out which one's where, but then also like that question of, okay, how far?
But again, it's always iterative, right? Because like, it's not like they just had Mario in a void running around, right? Like they tested and developed the movement by prototyping levels to interact with to see how it would feel, right? Yeah. So it's all circular. You know? Like, there is definitely a point where like, once you've committed to a certain thing and you start building on top of it, then you're in it now.
Yeah. And if it turned out that as you move on, you're like, oh fuck, that prevents this path. Now the question is like, can we get away with that path not being there? Do we have to rebuild?
That's the saddest one.
Or do we just fix it in the sequel?
So like for this internal tool, the plan right now is like, I was planning from the beginning because I was like, I'm basically making a prototype so we can actually try all these ideas and iterate on it and see if it's as productive as we thought it might be, right? But the whole time I was like, there's going to have to be a second one because there's not a chance
we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, there's not a chance in hell that I'm going to get to the end of like the functional prototype that does everything we think we want to do with all the stuff that's going to go into that and be like, yeah, this is a good foundation to continue working off of, right? And so we went into that knowing that was going to happen, which was like at some point we're going to throw away months of software development. But
you take it with
that was an investment in knowing how to build it.
We're recycling it.
Yeah, we're recycling it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, reduce, reuse.
But sometimes you can't. Sometimes you don't have time. You know. Yeah,
short. I don't know. I don't know if there are names for design patterns.
There's tons of them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what you would call it, but it is, as you can hear from the entire discussion and everything happened,
not standard
and non-standard, and I don't know.
Yeah. Just don't over-engineer. I think if you can try to not answer every single fucking question that you think you could ever have about something, because you're just gonna be wrong. So just
get the gist.
Try to take the most salient steps that you can identify toward your goal. Get to a point where you can use the thing and try to use that then to figure out what your next questions are, and
make sure it's a loop. And otherwise, I guess part of it is like, this is also why for me personally, just refactoring and I don't just mean refactoring like cleaning things up, but as like, I re-architect my projects constantly. Like if I start bumping into a thing that just is like starting to get hard, that I'm like, this foundation can't support the next, X months of development without making my life hell and the software start to suck, right? And so as part of that loop, to make all of this work, it's like you have to have a willingness to just rip shit out, replace things, and invest in your own ability to do that through your tools and your just skills along those dimensions to do
clean code. Try to make your architecture understandable, But keep tricky. Stay on your toes, be flexible. And that's all the time we have for this week. Great questions. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa Acosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost it up the charts and help it have a successful launch, and we'd appreciate it. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.